Right, hello everyone. Let me introduce you today Elizabeth Bolton from the Curriculum Teaching and Learning Department. She will be talking today about technology and empathy.
Okay, thanks, Yasid. I'm going to talk about empathy in a kind of a new way. I'm trying to move us towards talking about empathy in a way that's technical. And what I mean by that is I kind of want to start talking about empathy the way that people talk about reader response theories, and see if I can develop like a model for this, because empathy is a big interest of mine. One, because I am very in touch with my emotions. I have personal experience with post-traumatic stress, and that's a very emotion-centered experience. I also have a brother who has Asperger's syndrome, and I grew up with him. So empathy is like this core element in my life so far. And specifically, I've been trying to understand how it works so that you can tap into it in situations where you really need to. And that's been a big challenge. And I'm calling it inhabiting the lived experience of the other, because I want to talk about empathy in terms of actually like entering into the experience of another person. So I want to start with two definitions of empathy from the Oxford English Dictionary. One is very common, and the other, the OED says, is now rare. The common one is the ability to understand and appreciate the feelings of another. And that's typically what we think of when we think of empathy, right? Like if your friend says to you, I'm really sad because I failed my calculus test. And you say, oh, I get that. I failed my French test last week. That's understanding or getting or appreciating someone else's feeling, right? The other definition, the one that's rare, comes from the field of aesthetics and actually has to do with the projection of your personality into the thing that you're contemplating and coming to an understanding of it by really like entering into that artistic experience. And that one is rare, but that's the one that I think is really interesting. So we have like understanding versus actually inhabiting. So inhabiting is the kind of empathy that I wanted to talk about today. It's in the context of my master's thesis, and it's kind of like an accidental project that I wasn't aiming to find in there, but it ended up coming out of my master's thesis. My thesis was all about adults responding to fairy tales, and I took this idea from Bruno Bettelheim. He wrote this book called The Uses of Enchantment. It was all about how reading fairy tales to children helps them with their emotional development. And I had that experience when I was experiencing trauma symptoms. I could basically only read fairy tales. Like no other genre could hold my attention. Nothing else really made that much sense to me. It was a really like strange time. But I experienced this like weird phenomenon where fairy tales were just everything to me for like 3 years. So that was my master's thesis project. And that's where this idea of empathy and looking at it in a technical way came from. So I did a semi-structured interview, and I interviewed another OISE student. She's a PhD student. She's also a teacher of literature herself, and she also loves fairy tales, and I picked her because of that. I didn't think that I could administer a fairy tale to a person and expect to see some emotional response. I thought I should make sure that response was very likely, and then sort of put it like in a petri dish and look at it up close. So that's what I did with my participant. Her pseudonym is Hannah, and I interviewed Hannah about her favorite fairy tale, which was Peter Pan. And so, long story short, I won't get too much into it because my time is limited, but what I looked at in the transcribed discussion, I'll call it, it was more a discussion than an interview, I looked at conceptual metaphor. And the reason why I looked at that was because metaphor is making sense of the abstract in terms of the concrete, right? We pull our material from what we know and what we've experienced to make sense of something that doesn't really have a substance. And we do that a lot of times with emotions because emotions are always abstract. So For example, if we really want to say that we're really extremely humiliated, we might say, I wanted to melt into the floor, right? Rather than like, I was really, really humiliated. So we take from the experience with physical matter, with things melting, and we map that onto the abstract concept of emotion, humiliation. And so there's a guy who did a lot of research on conceptual metaphor. His name is George Lakoff, and he named those two domains. The abstract he called the target, because that's the thing that we're targeting and trying to understand. The concrete he called the source, because that's what we're taking from to make sense of that. So now that we've got all this background information, here's the major metaphoric structure that governed almost our entire discussion, and this is where I'll get to where the empathy came in. So basically, there were maybe 40 instances or so of reading being characterized as a journey through space, where other metaphor categories had maybe like less than 10, but the journey one had close to 40. So this was like by far the most common metaphor in our discussion of like what this fairy tale means to us. Lakoff called this the event structure metaphor because other metaphors that fit into this are anything that is an event conceptualized as an action in space. For example, if I said he got over a really nasty divorce, that's also an event. It's the event of feeling better after a divorce has happened, conceptualized as actually getting over some physical obstacle, right? So this is another example of the event structure metaphor. And so the one that we talked about was reading as a journey, and Hannah kind of got into this almost immediately. She started talking about reading her favorite fairy tale as this experience of going someplace, of like traveling somewhere. So there was all this language in there about taking a journey through space. And what was really, really incredible was that it wasn't just like a path that she talked about. It was a departure point and a destination and the nature of that path and the reasons for taking that path. So all of this was like folded in to the discussion. And here's where the empathy comes in. Hannah and I created this image of this journey, this path, collaboratively. So we both picked up on this same metaphor. I think I picked up on it from her, and we both contributed to that image. And so I just picked one example to show, and I called it collaborative metaphor because it was a construction of a metaphor by two people. I don't know, I guess we can just read this. Yessi, do you want to read Hannah?
Yes.
And I'll be myself? Okay.
I think that fairy tale offers me that way to escape, a way to reimagine, and lots of times I don't want to live in the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's the whole like anything you want thing. Like literally anything you want, you can build that. And it's funny that you mention not coming from a place of deep hurt with it, because it's actually the same coming from a place of deep hurt. Because this realm of possibility is huge. Because you're like, it doesn't have to be this way. I don't have to feel like this. I can go there and feel like this.
Yeah, and even the fact that I didn't come from a place of deep hurt, but even extreme complacency or boredom can also be depressing, and sadness as well. Like if we need escape, for instance, if we need to reimagine, I think that those two mediums can bring us to fairy tale and bring us to getting something out of it.
Okay, thanks, Yasib. That was very authentic. So this is just one example of the collaborative metaphor. Everything that's in purple is pertains to this concept of the journey. So right off the bat, Hannah describes the path as like a means of escape. So we already know that the place she's coming from is a place that she doesn't want to be. And her journey along this path is volitional. She's doing it of her own will because she wants to. Because we never escape from something that we like, right? It's always like we don't want to be there anymore, so we choose to escape. And so then Hannah starts to talk about the nature of the departure point of this journey image. And she does that by saying, I don't want to live in the world. So we know the departure point is current reality. That's our real world, which is not satisfactory to us in some way. It's hurting us or making us uncomfortable. So we decide to leave by opening this book, this favorite book. And so I add to that, and actually here's where I conceptualize regions in space as emotional states. So I talk about coming from a place of deep hurt. That's in reference to trauma. And I call that a place because that's my starting point for taking this journey. That's where I came from. And I even go so far as to talk about the nature of the destination, and specifically its size. I call it huge. I say that it's huge because of the imaginative possibility that you can find there, you know? So we're really talking about the change in emotion from reading a favorite fairy tale in terms of like physical space, like actions in space. So think of like, you've got one emotional state that's not so comfortable, and so you take this path by opening the book, reading the fairy tale, making meaning from the text, and you arrive in this other region. And so then Hannah, actually I think this is really exciting. Hannah starts to make up her own departure points in terms of emotional states. She didn't come from a place of deep hurt, she says, because she didn't talk about trauma symptoms, right? But she says extreme complacency, boredom, and sadness. Those are her possible departure points for this journey. And she also characterizes those as things that will bring you to the fairy tale. So not even just departure points, but also vehicles. So this is kind of, hopefully I'm giving sort of like a multi-dimensional image of this, this journey, this picture, which ultimately looked like this. Emotional states are locations. We're coming from negative locations, hurt, sadness, boredom, and we're moving to comfort, safety, joy, whatever you get from engaging with the fairy tale. The means of attaining that emotional change is the path. That's the same as opening the book and just reading the words. And specifically in this case, the destination point we also know is a goal. This is something that Hannah and I do on purpose because we love fairy tales and we know how they make us feel, and so we open them again and again. So basically what I'm getting at is that we conceptualized our entire experience with experiencing emotional change from reading a fairy tale as a movement through space. We created this image and we actually did it together. We did it collaboratively. And it ended up being this hugely empathetic experience. I actually had tears in my eyes at the end of the interview. And this was, you know, prior to the interview, I didn't know this person that well. We probably spent maybe like 15 minutes in total talking to each other. But by the end of it, there was this connection that you could feel, that I was really communicating with a person who understood what this literature meant to me, and I understood what it meant to her, even though we'd had such different life experiences. So I'll just mention one more thing to bring this back to empathy. There's another guy who did a lot of writing on conceptual metaphor. His name was Michael Reddy, and he talked about this metaphor called the conduit metaphor. It's like a framework for communication. We see it when we say things like if your friend says, I'm sad because I failed my test, and you say, oh, I get that. The conduit is like conceptualizing the thought as like a thing that comes through the air to you, and then you actually like catch it and get it and possess it as a model for communication. And if we think about empathy in this way, which we often do, then it's as simple as me just kind of like plucking sadness out of my body and wrapping it up and just handing it to you and being like, there, empathy. Easy, right? But it doesn't actually work that way. And so Michael Reddy talked about this. He said this is a framework for communication that shows success without effort. If we look at empathy as just getting it, it's not really empathy because we're not putting anything into it. If you think of any time you've ever empathized with a person, you put something into that. You might put just as much into it as they do, you know?
You inhabit,
Hmm?
right? You inhabit.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah.
the word that you're using today.
Mhm. Yeah. Inhabit, enter. So the model I'm moving towards is more like this, with the collaborative metaphor. We were able to see that here is this space that we both created, and then both of us entered it um, by supplying the language that made that image. And because it was language that was rooted in experience and like real physical space, like the actual space of being a human standing on 2 feet, walking a path, that's a real common shared experience that 2 people can inhabit. And that, Reddy says, is a framework wherein energy must be expended in order for 2 people to really understand each other. So that's kind of like what I'm starting with for this model of empathy that I wanted to develop, and it's completely through the lens of language that I'm looking at it. And you know, this is a limited study. It's empathy in a petri dish, and it comes with all the limitations that petri dishes do. But it just has me thinking in situations where you got 2 people with like really different viewpoints, or like in your case, if you have like situations of like intense conflict, it might help to start looking at what this experiential space might be. What is the space that everyone can inhabit? What's a space that people can build collaboratively? And you can even see in the case of me and Hannah, we didn't come from the same place. Hannah never had trauma symptoms, but she had something else that brought her to the fairy tale. But we still really understood each other. So, you know, it's kind of like we're getting on the freeway on different entry points, but we're traveling on the same freeway, maybe in different lanes. My exit might be coming up sooner than Hannah's, I don't know, but you know, we're going in the same direction, and we're letting each other change lanes and letting each other merge, and like this kind of image for this movement in space. So yeah, collaborative metaphor as a way of looking at empathy as 2 people inhabiting the same lived experience. And these are my references if you want to read more. This one is really good. Metaphors We Live By. It's like a thin book, and it's really interesting and like easy to read. That's all I have.
Good job.
Thank you.
Great. So, do you guys have any questions or comments for Elizabeth today?
It's a quiet group today.
Yes, very quiet.
Yeah, I'm interested to know what you guys think of it, because I have never spoken to anyone about this out loud before.
I think that the first thing that came to my mind was the idea of inhabit.
Mm-hmm.
And at the beginning, before you said your metaphor, where you're coming from,
Mm-hmm.
inhabit for me was, at that moment in the beginning, problematic. Why? Because I am here,
Mm-hmm.
and when you say inhabit, for me, it's like you are coming into my space. So sort of like translating my.
Oh, you're thinking of like putting yourself in someone else's shoes.
Exactly. No, not in someone else. Like in me, like
In your body.
in me,
Yeah.
my body, my
Yeah.
thoughts, my feelings, my emotions.
Right.
But then later I thought maybe you refer mostly as I feel you. I know I get you. I know what you mean. I've been in that road.
Mm-hmm.
So I empathize with you.
Yeah.
But now it's a different thing in which both we are going to inhabit
Yeah.
a new space that we collaborate and we both create. But although we are coming from different parts, then we create this new
Yeah.
place that we inhabit. Is that what I get from
Yeah.
the presentation?
Yeah, it's a space that wouldn't exist were it not for the collaboration. So we're thinking of empathy as like, you know, like I either get it from this person or I get it by putting my feet in this person's shoes. But I'm saying that it's a thing that comes about kind of like independently of that experience.
Right.
It's something that is constructed collaboratively, and I really feel as though both people who are involved are putting equal amounts into it. That's what it seems like to me. So I'll explore that more for the PhD, which
That was my next question.
Yeah.
How are you planning to explore this into the PhD, that dissertation?
That's a good question. I think first and foremost, I need to interview more people because my master's thesis was just one interview. And it was also a case where I was fairly certain that we were going to empathize with each other.
Right.
So I think I need to look at a lot of different situations, a lot of different topics. Not necessarily like situations where I think conflict is going to come about,
Right,
but just situations where empathy might be a challenge or might not be very likely, or just like situations where there's a great need for an examination of where empathy could take place and how we could bring people to that space.
Can I say something really quick?
Mm-hmm.
Because the reason why I'm asking you that question about what you're planning to do with this and your PhD is because it happened to me. I finished my master's here and immediately I started a PhD. So initially I thought, and I said to myself, oh, I'm just gonna continue doing this, but I'll just top it up a little bit, like, a little bit, and then just sort of continuing that.
Right.
But as I'm taking courses, as I'm meeting new people, as I'm meeting other people, then conversations come and go, and then those ideas change.
Mm-hmm.
And for what I've noticed and for what I perceive for myself, is like the master thesis is this little thing.
Yeah.
But in my opinion, my dissertation or PhD should be looking at a bigger thing, looking at one thing but on a bigger scale. Like for example,
Right.
the way I see yours could be something, how can empathy can have an impact on an education, education in more in general terms, like in an education system,
Right.
in different schools, public versus private,
Yeah.
and in developing countries, how does this work? But it's just me thinking,
Right.
now that I
Well,
think globally, internationally, how does this work
Uh-huh.
in these things? Because what Yoki was saying, like, it seems there is this gap that we're going into schools and we're focusing too much on the test and the curriculum, and we pay little attention to the emotions, to the spirituality, and what the children or students are coming into
Right.
class.
Yeah.
So I wonder if I invite you to look into that in the near future. Not that you have to do it, but think a
Yeah,
little bit
well,
of
I think
bigger
first
issues.
and foremost is like situating this in the literature classroom, because I did start with responding to literature, and I'm big on the idea of I don't even want to call it literature because it's both reading and writing, that being
Literacy.
the heart of, oh yeah, there is that word, right? That being the heart of like an emotional education, because like I talked about Guy Allen's expressive writing class earlier, like there's so much in there. So if I was gonna look at like one context, I would look at that one. But I think also like intercultural interactions and
Yeah, makes
interlinguistic would also be pretty useful.
Emotional literacy also has to do with that a little bit, like talking about how emotions have to do with how people learn languages
How many more minutes?
through the
30 minutes.
dialogue,
Yeah.
and
I'll bring
literature, reading and
Okay.
writing, and multiliteracy. And you can talk a little bit about emotional literacy.
I like that term.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
good.
So that was such a rewarding presentation. You opened up emotionally comforting space.
Oh, good.
Yes, that's how I felt.
That's good.
Kind of soothing. And because you're considering in what directions you might want to explore, where to expand, doing more interviews, and who knows what might happen. I just wanted to throw into the discussion here the notion from Theravada Buddhism of divine abodes, which is what I'm looking at, and minimally cross-culturally translating and applying the English words, English terms as I understand. I cannot pretend that I'm applying things in a Buddhist context from a Buddhist rooted culture. So the four Brahma-viharas, divine abodes, are rendered in English as compassion, equanimity, loving kindness, which builds a bridge to the Christian term love, and joy, which is what I would like to focus on in my comment. I'm thinking that sympathy, loving kindness can be healing, soothing for somebody else's pain. This is where empathy plays into it as a technology, as a medium for moral support, emotional support to flow toward another, to help heal. Equanimity, maybe you need it to stay balanced, stay grounded, stay rooted. So it's still like in reaction to something you need to overcome, something you need to heal from. So I'm specifically interested in the pedagogical and interpersonal implications of the sympathetic joy. If I may share, I'm thinking that the crown of pedagogical empathy is when the one who is more knowledgeable, the one who contributes, the one who leads in knowledge making, it may be the student, it may be the teacher, it may be a staff person, when they're able to feel joy for the achievement of their own student and be happy for another. So I was considering putting on the table the possibility of exploring the situation where two or more people come not necessarily from a space in a place of trauma and hurt, but maybe achievement, maybe celebration, and maybe considering how rewarding it can be to share the joy through sympathetic joy. So, how do you feel about that?
I like that a lot, and I'm glad that you mentioned it because actually it hadn't occurred to me because I've been so buried in this as like my master's thesis that I had this model stuck in my mind of the emotional change going from negative to positive, and it can be sort of hard to place that in a classroom, but what you're talking about, I think, is maybe a better fit because it just seems to be like more in the direction of encouragement and support and like maybe more immediately applicable in a lot of classroom situations. And I mean, I hate to say it, but people don't like to talk about trauma. It makes people uncomfortable. Every time I say that, someone shakes their head like that. It's true. It's absolutely true. And I know it better than anyone. I say the word trauma and people are like, oh, okay, trauma. But this is the same kind of thing that we're looking at, and people hear that and they're very open to it, you know? So I think maybe that might even be like the thing to start with, especially in the field of education. That could be like the thing that kind of, you know, gets the idea in. And there's a ton of different like departure points to look at for these kind of things, you know. So that's a really cool idea. I'm going to read about sympathetic joy.
Jack Miller's work cannot not include that. I can give you references from the Canadian Philosophy of Education Society journal. It used to be called Putnam. In English, it is pronounced Paidusis. The Greek pronunciation would be something like Pedevsi. I consulted a Greek friend of mine, so I may not be pronouncing it completely correctly, but that's what I'm saying, closer to. They renamed it to a title that has to do with inquiry. I apologize for not remembering, but if you do a search on Paidusis, I'll send you an email. And look at the issues for 2010 and 2012. They're dedicated to explorations into Buddhist traditions. And Theravada Buddhism is the older tradition. If you come across the term Pali canon, Pali is the language in which that canon was eventually recording. So that's one source you can read about on sympathetic joy. And I was wondering about, I was a linguist at some point in the past, and I have some memory of Lakoff's metaphors we live by. And I'm thinking that in today's world, when we're thinking of the spaces we grew up in, the spaces it's easier for us to own, we seem to kind of lean toward the negative. You're kind of prepared for someone to share and be understood when they're sharing an experience that is not necessarily an experience of exuberance.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, what if pedagogical practice, education, focuses also on explorations of uplifting each other specifically, and switching to non-dichotomous metaphors, and switching to a metaphor like growth that comes from Dewey, community that comes from Dewey, the classic pragmatists, and also from indigenous traditions around the world. So these may seem like words that name the thing. They're not so much a metaphor, but we can certainly build metaphors around those. And language in pedagogical practice that takes us there.
Yeah, I like this. This is good. I mean, this is all stuff that's like outside of the petri dish, you know? There's a lot out there. And there's like I think a lot of implications for this. But I guess the next step for me is to like collect a lot more data so that I can kind of start to like develop ideas and maybe test them out in certain situations. But I'm gonna keep that thought in mind of like uplifting and having that be a starting point, because I like that a lot.
Thank you. And I'm happy to invite both you and Ryan, because you have full-length papers to consider publishing in the online journal Mind and Time, whose origin is symbolically time and mind projecting onto history and philosophy. There used to be a history and philosophy program at OIC.
Oh, that's too bad there isn't one anymore.
Which is where I started my PhD program. And this is a conference that, to me, resurrects the space of the humanities in a more active way.
Yeah.
So
That's why I found myself here.
you're quite philosophical, according to my definition of philosophy.
Yeah, that was accidental. I don't know how I ended up in this place.
Things happen for a reason, right? Somebody said here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's true.
That's how it is.
That's true.
So, did you get in touch with Brian? Did you exchange any comments about your papers?
Not yet, but I did read his paper. I can send him some commentary. I thought his paper was really interesting. He writes about doing research in Amish communities and like going in there as a researcher and representing some idea of like individual achievement that the whole community thinks is sort of like frivolous.
Right.
And it's kind of like against their way of being. It's pretty interesting though, because I think most people probably don't know that much about Amish communities.
Nowadays,
Yeah.
I need to get going, so I'm kind of
Okay.
late to my
Right.
stuff. But
So
thank you very much
let's
for
wrap it
everything.
up.
And then I'll see you.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah,
So
thank you for coming.
feel free to join the Amish session at 5:30, and then the professor from Mississauga, large classes.